The women's suffrage movement. The problem with the women's suffrage movement is that it always happened during a wartime, whether it was the Civil War or World War One. Because it was happening during wartime, the president was always more focused on, the country dying. But whenever we reached a new level of morality and happiness, and the slaves are free, and everyone's getting along again, there's always a setback. Originally, these women that were very important in the suffragist campaign came together and wanted to abolish slavery, which seemed like a pretty, good thing to do. But then it slowly started turning into a women's rights campaign, because people started to realize that when they meant all men were free, they meant all men were free. So you could probably imagine where a lot of women were coming from. While the late 1800s were sort of the start for the women's suffrage campaign, it started moving into the 1910s, which is the more important era, because this is when things started to get, serious. It's like slavery is abolished, now what? Now we focus on ourselves. The AWSA and the NWSA realized that they should probably, work together, because having two parties wanting the same thing colliding against each other wasn't really a good image for the women's suffrage campaign. So they formed together. The National National Americans Women's Suffrage Association. This organization became sort of a parent organization, looking over all the miniature groups and all the cities and the states and whatnot. So it's 1914, and this girl named Alice Paul comes along and says, "I don't like the way that they're running things." Carrie Chapman Catt, the current president of the NAWSA, decided to distance herself from Alice Paul and that little thing that she was doing, because it wasn't ladylike. Because Alice Paul and Lucy Burns' idea of a movement is to not just sit there and make phone calls all day. They wanted action. They wanted signs. They wanted sashes. They wanted to roam the streets telling men that they matter too. But all their main focus was the Democratic Party. So for these two different parties within a party to go after that party, it was a hot mess. Now with this movement, much like other movements, there was imprisonment, there was torture. Whenever they did parades and marches and walks, there was always somebody to throw a bottle, and then the whole riot starts. A lot of these women had husbands who didn't support their cause, so they started treating them poorly too. But the NAWSA and the NWP were both doing a pretty decent job at getting the numbers, and with their combined efforts, in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and women now had the right to vote. So it should be a happy ending, but it took a lot of states plenty of years to get their crap together, because, some states weren't all, suddenly there's a 19th Amendment, and it's like, oh, we love women now. No, it wasn't like that. In fact, it took plenty of tens of years for some states to hop on the women rights train. Another downside to this is that just because women could now vote, black women weren't really a part of that equation. It's just kind of like a pecking order, I guess, because even in the marches and all the campaigns, the black women had to sit in the back, because racism doesn't die just that quickly. Just because they wanted to abolish slavery doesn't mean that these people were equals to them. So even people that were fighting for women's rights and women's suffrage did not care about the black people. And I'm sure you've heard of something called the Jim Crow laws. The women's suffrage movement didn't really do anything for those things to come. This idea of togetherness, womanhood, and strength sadly did not include the minorities of that group. And as sad as it is, the women's suffrage thing was still pretty, important and very, prideful for us. It's just, I wish it would have been, ahead of its time a little bit.
But I guess we're just gonna stay racist for a while, aren't we?